Okay. Yeah, I want to talk about Storybook. About me, just 2 sentences. My name is Jonas, and I'm a volunteer developer for Zerlo. Zerlo is a non-profit organization that that's main project for Zerlo is the platform Zerlo.org. It's basically a wiki for open educational resources. So check it out. And what we are doing currently is we are developing Zerlo ABC. This is a free literacy app written in React Native. And we are also using Storybook. So if you want to see a real-world example of how to use React Storybook in React Native, you can check out our GitHub repository. The code is open source. And secondly, what our partner Ori is doing, they are building an editor for the web that is also written in React and most importantly is extensible. So you can write new plugins for the editor, for example, Google Maps plugin or something like that, that your authors that write stuff on the web can use for building the site. You can check out our website. I will put the slides later in the meetup, and you can test out the editor if you want. And it's also free and open source, so yeah. And if you're into that, you can check me out on GitHub, Medium, and Twitter on the username Jona. Okay, so let's start with Storybook. I made some small example to show you what it's all about. So meet Qtify. Qtify is a small app that I built for your daily dose of cuteness. So basically, similar to other apps, you have a sign-up process. Some stuff. And you can check what animals you like. Dogs are cute, cats are cute, fellas are cute too. And then you can select some text. Okay, what do we do if we want to test a single step of this? So currently this thing is built step by step, and I can't really go to a specific step without entering the data before it. So for example, I have to reload the page if I want to test the form again. And that's rather annoying. So what I could do is to write some dummy code so that I, for example, go to step 2 automatically or something like that. But this is usually code I don't want to write, and I don't want to have it in my production app. And what Storybook allows us is to basically define multiple entry points for our app. This is especially good for React Native, where we only have one entry point, but also useful for React for Web. So in this example, I built a small storybook, and on the left side, you see the so-called stories. For example, the first story renders the app as you've seen before. Then I have a story for the form for the first step. So you can see here first step, and I can type some stuff. I will talk about that in a moment. And you can also define some properties that the component should get. So for example, I could have a pre-filled form with my email address or with email address and password, which is especially interesting if you have some kind of form validation. So then I could define some stories that already have some input with that is not validated correctly, for example. And there are also stories for the other steps. So for example, the second step where we can select the animals, we can also define some stuff beforehand. So for example, that the cat is already selected. And also for the third one. So basically, it gives you multiple entry points that you can view. And those entry points could either be views of your app directly or some component you won't use solely in a view, but rather in multiple places. For example, a button component you define that is used in multiple locations. And this thing on the bottom allows you to mock callbacks. I will later show you the code on how this is done. But currently, for example, if I type something, then here you see that some action is triggered. So for example, in this case, if I type something, then the callback is called with some parameters. So basically, this allows you to test events in Storybook without you having to really submit the forms or something like that. Okay, before we go into the code, I will just tell you some stuff why this, or some things why this is good. So reason one, basically you can define multiple entry points without you having to write dummy code in any way. Like I said, this is good for React Native because in React Native you only have one entry point, and it's rather annoying to have to switch out some stuff to render some other part. And you could also use this for Electron because in Electron you also have this one entry point, and it's not so easy to configure your Electron so that it has hot module reloading and stuff like that. And what you can do is you could use Storybook for the components that don't need Electron API and develop them in the Storybook and don't have to start your Electron app to view them, for example. I didn't say the Storybook also has hot module reloading like Create React app. So you can just open your Storybook, change some lines in your editor, and you directly see the changes without reloading or stuff like that. Second point, it encourages you to make your components reusable because you always have to define all assumptions that you have. You pass all props the component needs. You define wrapper components that you assume that the component is used in. So for example, if you have a link component that is always used in, or should be used in a navigation, you can define your stories like that. So people see that the link item shouldn't be used somewhere else. And it also, similar to test-driven development, encourages you to think about the API first. So if you write your story first, you have to define which props does your component want and how does your component work. So that's basically good. And thirdly, the stories are a good documentation for your developers. You already define some test cases that I can look into and see how the component should be used. And you can also export the Storybook for React for Web so that you can, for example, if you are building a UI library for React, you can publish this directly as a documentation. So users of your library can view the examples, and we will see an example later of libraries that use that. And you can also give the Storybook to your designers so that they can all view all the components with the different usage examples and can review if this all looks as intended. And what is also good, your developers can work independently without worrying on how the app renders your components. You can, for example, define different components that your developers work on them and integrate them later in the real app. So you already have this example and they can at least do the UI, and later you, if that all works correctly, then you can integrate it into your real app. Okay, yeah, let's look into some code for the storybook that I showed you before. So just to get back to the example, basically we had 4 sections, namely the app itself and 3 steps. And in each step there were multiple different stories with different properties. And so the code for that, so the simplest case is the app itself. So basically you wrap your stories into the stories of helper. That is basically the section that was shown on the left side. So this creates a section of stories with the name app. And then you can define different stories with the function .add. So they all have a name. So this is basically the subsection of the story with the name default entry. And the second argument to the function is a function that returns a component. So basically it defines your root component that is rendered in Storybook. And if it's a little bit more complicated, let's look at step 1. Ignore line 24 for now with the decorator. I will talk about that later. But basically it's the same as before. You define a new section. This section could also be part of another file, so you don't have to write everything in one file. It's just for the example. And usually you would split your stories for each component, so each component would have a story file, for example. And then we also add a story with the name empty form. And since you just return a component, you can also pass the props you want to it. So for example, this case, you pass the empty state to the account data step component. And set state is another prop that is used when the form changes or when I'm typing something. And that is defined above. So basically, Storybook allows or exports a helper called action. That is basically the thing you saw in the action logger below. Actions are rather easy. You pass them a title, like set state. So set state will be shown below. And what this creates is a function that just accepts anything and will log the arguments that it is passed into the logger. So if you look at this again, so if my account data step uses its prop set state, this will be logged under the title set state with all parameters that they are passed to. And you can also use this action, for example, for stuff like a button, the on-click handler, so that you see when this is triggered, or when forms are changed, something like that. And you can basically define more stories. For example, in this story, we pass a whole state, in this case with an email address and a password. Same principle. And about the line, where was it? Line 24, this decorator. Storybook allows you to define decorators for your stories. This is useful if you have stuff or assumptions about the parent components of your component. So for example, in this Qtify app, I used Material UI. And if you know Material UI, you have to always wrap your component in your team provider. So that passes styles down and stuff like that. And so if I use some component, I always have to wrap it. And a decorator allows you to define those wrapping. Basically, a decorator gets your story as an input. So for example, this component here. And what you should do is return a new component, basically. So in this case, I will just wrap the story in this mock wrapper that does the material UI setup. And you can also use this if you, for example, if you need a higher order component in some way that your component should be wrapped into. So basically, it allows you to define what your component should be rendered into. Yeah, and that are all helpers that the Storybook module exports. So the stories off was the thing to create your sections of stories. Actions was to mock callbacks. And the third helper that I didn't use in this example is link to. This is similar to action. So it also, not directly. So basically it's link to allows you to create links to other stories. So you can, if you have a button component in your app, you can say, okay, if this button is clicked, switch to another story. So you can basically build a small prototype in your Storybook. But yeah, I think those two are the most important, and I usually don't need link to. Okay, are there questions so far?
Does link to override your button
handler? No, it doesn't override your button handler. It's your component that you pass the link to has to use this prop. So basically, you could, for example, write a component that accepts an on-click handler, and instead of a real on-click handler, you can pass this link to. I'm not so sure about the real API, but basically it accepts some kind of ID for the story and acts as a click handler, more or less. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Yeah, then let's look into some more examples. For example, the React Native for Web documentation uses a Storybook to show its components. And as you see, this is hosted on GitHub pages, so it's a static app. So you don't need a node server or something like that to render your Storybook if you build it. You can just deploy it somewhere. And for examples in the components, they have examples for all the components they're using. For example, the activity indicator. There are some examples on how to use it. And they are also using some add-on that I will talk later about that basically allows you to write also documentation in your stories. So they are like writing documentation and then have an example that renders a component. And this is a nice way to write documentation for your library. And yeah, you can basically click through. They also have examples for the APIs, like the clipboard. Yeah. And some creator demo. Exactly. And also React Dates is another React Storybook. Basically a date component, and you have stuff like the calendar, for example, single month. And they are also using some kind of wrapper, like say above. So use this wrapper to show a grid in all stories. So you can also use Storybook like that. And as a last example, Zello ABC, like I already said, we also use Storybook. And in a React Native app, it's a little bit different. You can't just open a Storybook and have the preview directly because, yeah, React Native only works on mobile. But in this case, I already opened the app. You basically have the Storybook like before, but you don't have to preview directly. but the preview will be in your app. So, for example, here are stories for the different exercise types we use in our app, and we can switch to different exercises and preview them in our app. So it also works for React Native, yeah, but it's not as nice as in React for web. What's basically happening in the background is that Storybook starts a packager similar to the React Native packager that basically starts this web server so that you can view your components and switch between them, and changes your usual app entry point to the Storybook component that listens on the WebSocket on changes here. That's basically how this works. Okay. And just to give you a small idea on how you could set up your React project with Storybook. Basically, in the usual case, you only need get Storybook. This is a helper or a command line tool they're written for Storybook. And you can just go into your React app that already exists or was created by Create React App, it doesn't matter, and execute get Storybook. And what this will do is it installs all dependencies you need, so basically a Storybook, and adds the NPM task for you. So basically one to start your Storybook that has all the nice stuff like hot module reloading. And if you use React for web, it also has a task to export the Storybook. So to export the Storybook as a static app that you can deploy somewhere. And if you have done this, you can always, if you develop, start your Storybook with this one npm task, basically npm run Storybook. And you can also do this in parallel to your usual app, so you can preview both. You can look into the Storybook if you're developing some signal component, and you can also look into your real app. Yeah, for React Native, it's similar. So this part is basically the same. Get Storybook also already checks if you have, or tests if you're using React or React Native. So this is done automatically. And then the usage is a little bit different because you have to do two things. Basically, you start the Storybook, which, like I said before, starts this web server to view your components, and starts something like the React Native packager. And then you can start your app like you usually do. So, for example, with React Native Run iOS, you would start the iOS simulator, but you can also start your app on a real device. So it's, yeah, because Storybook just injects more or less the React Native packager. If you use Create React Native App or Expo, the setup is a little bit different because there are some assumptions in those projects. But I wrote a blog post about that. It's not so hard, but you have to make a couple of changes and can't just run get Storybook, and yeah. But yeah, it works also with Create React Native App, and like I said, Zello ABC uses Create React Native App, and there you have a real-world example. Okay. To conclude that, I have some. There are also some add-ons for Storybook. There's on the Storybook website. There's a gallery for a couple of add-ons. I selected some that are rather interesting. So, for example, the Story Shots add-on allows you to use your stories directly for snapshot testing. which is quite nice. So basically you don't have to write additional snapshot tests for your components. Then there's knobs. This allows you to edit the props that are passed to the components in your stories directly in the Storybook UI. Let's just switch to it. So basically you get a new panel on the right side, and then you can change the props and have a live preview of how this affects your component. And there are a couple of add-ons that allows you to write documentation. So for example, there's notes and info. And I think one of them is used in the React Native for Web Storybook. Yeah, so you can define like readmes for your components. Just a little thing to note, a couple of the add-ons don't work with React Native Storybook, so you have to watch out a little bit. Yeah, but they all work for React for Web. Yes, that's from my side. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.
You started to talk about saying and not adding any dummy code into your production application. But what will you do with these things we have added for Storybook? Can you remove them easily afterwards, or what is the procedure for doing that?
Basically, it's completely decoupled from your real app. So in your real app, you import your components and use them. And if you use Storybook, you usually have additional files like component name.stories.js. And those aren't imported in your real app, but rather in some config file that Storybook uses. But this config file won't be part of your real app.
But in real app, you make import Storybook.
Yeah, that's the story file.
Okay.
The story file that won't be used in your real app. So basically, if you have a React app, you basically have this folder .storybook that has some config file that is automatically generated. And here you require the story files. In this example, I just had one story file, but usually you would have multiple story files. And this is the only place that your stories will be imported. And the config file will only be used by Storybook. So if you go into stores, into your stories, this won't be part of your real app at all. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned that Storybook is helpful for you to coordinate with your designer. Can you tell me what that exchange is like? So you set your designer up with permissions to your repository, and you have them fetch the latest changes and run Storybook, run the simulator, all of this?
Yeah, basically we are doing it like that. So if you use Create React Native app, then the designer only needs an npm, a node setup. It's the only thing he needs. And then he can start the Storybook and open the app on his phone. And yeah, if you use React Native for web, it's even easier because you can deploy the Storybook itself and you just need a browser. But yeah, that's usually the way we do it. So yeah, we write the components, show them to the designers, and they give feedback, basically. And yeah, they have access to the GitHub repository. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially it's a way of them viewing what you've done, but they cannot design the components.
No, they cannot design, but they can give feedback what isn't like it should be, basically. Yeah.
So no more broken test builds or something like this. It's easier for them to get the latest components.
Yeah.
The actions are always just strings, or can you do an action with some functionality?
So basically, the actions only.
For logging purposes.
Storybook. Qtify Storybook. Basically, the actions only log what you put into them. So in this example, if I write something, then the component will pass an object with the corresponding keys to its setState method. So if I type something, that's the wrong thing here. If I type something, what I get is that setState logs its parameters. That will always be an array because you could pass multiple things. And in our case, we only use have one. Can I zoom this? Yeah, I can zoom this. We have only one parameter we pass to setState, and this is an object, and here just the object will be logged similar to your DevTools. But the actions don't have any function apart from that, so they're only logging what they get, so that you know what your components.
So they cannot manipulate your components.
No. If you want that, you basically have to write a wrapper that has this function. So you could write a wrapper that, for example, in this case,
puts the D on the input.
For example, yeah, like it's in a real app. So basically, what is done is that we have some wrapper component that holds the state, and the state is persisted through the steps. So the second step has access to this state from the first step, and so on. But yeah, you could write a wrapper for that if you want this functionality in your stories. Yeah.
How do I do in case I create like no state and just props like a Redux store, and I cannot just inject the state because I haven't any. Can I still use this library, or how does it work?
If I understand your question correctly, you have a Redux, as a connected Redux component. Yeah, you can. You have two possibilities for this. Either you wrap your stories with some Redux provider. That's one way to do this. But I would probably do it like I would use the unconnected Redux component and pass a mock state to it. So basically, your unconnected component will expect that the state is passed in some props. This is what you do with map state to props. And there you can put some object, for example. Okay. I think I'm done.
So let's make like 10 minutes break. And then we have the second block.
Zeitlich doch gar nicht so schlecht. Ja, so 35 Minuten.